Thank you, Stella. Thank you for that fantastic talk. It was just brilliant. And we didn't communicate beforehand, and I think we're going to build on each other's conversation here, aren't we? So thank you, and thank you so much to Stella for bringing us all together and for all the reasons that have already been discussed. It's a great space to be working in here and taking this forward. And I think what I'm going to be doing here is moving from the personal to the system, and to ask, how can we do those things that we need to do to personalize care within a system which at the moment maybe doesn't articulate that or permit that to happen very well. And also, how do we square the circle between what happens with individuals and what happens, again, across the system? So part of the debate has been public health versus the individual choice, for example. So if an individual chooses something which actually, if enough people chose that thing, would create a public health crisis, do we still support that choice, or don't we support that choice? How far do we, how can we, as I say, square the circle between these two things going forward? Now, I'm afraid I've named this short presentation, the naming of parts, and I use that word because it was just in my mind. And then I actually looked at the poem that it comes from, which is actually a poem written by a war poet in 1942. And when I read this out, I'm not suggesting that this is a direct analogy to birth at all. What I want you to hear in this poem is the conflation or the dissonance between the parts that are being discussed, the technical parts that are being discussed, to do with a gun, but that's irrelevant, and the natural world that's going on around it. And again, it's this kind of dissonance and potential for squaring those two things. So today we have naming of parts. Yesterday we had daily cleaning. And tomorrow morning, we shall have what to do after firing. But today we have naming of parts. Japonica glistens like coral in all of the neighboring gardens. And today we have naming of parts. This is the lower sling swivel. And this is the upper sling swivel, whose use you will see when you are given your slings. And this is the piling swivel, which in your case, you have not got. The branches hold in the gardens their silent, eloquent gestures, which in our cases, we have not got. This is the safety catch, which is always released with an easy flick of the thumb. And please do not let me see anyone using his finger. You can do it quite easy if you have any strength in your thumb. The blossoms are fragile and motionless, never letting anyone see any of them using their finger. And this you can see is the bolt. The purpose of this is to open the breech, as you see. We can slide it rapidly backwards and forwards. We call this easing the spring. And rapidly backwards and forwards, the early bees are assaulting and fumbling the flowers. They call it easing the spring. They call it easing the spring. It's perfectly easy if you have any strength in your thumb, like the bolt and the breech and the cocking piece and the point of balance, which in our case, we have not got. And the almond blossoms silent in all of the gardens and the bees going backwards and forwards. For today, we have naming of parts. So I think what's in here is some interesting metaphors about what happens when we deconstruct something to a very fine level. And also when that deconstruction is done in a context where some of the things that are required to make the thing function are not actually there. We don't have access to them. In the context of a broader system, which is carrying on almost oblivious. And I mean, as I say, I'm trying to make that association between birth as it happens and unfolds, and how we manage and deal with it in terms of the naming of parts. So the two pictures here are illustrating, previously the two pictures were illustrating that difference. And it's not to say that either is wrong. You know, to an extent, we have to do the naming of parts. It is important, but we also have to look at this bigger picture as well. So we obviously are operating in this risk management framework. And again, there's nothing intrinsically wrong with risk management. Risk management can be a very helpful process. And the consequences of the naming of parts, if you like, approach to this, which came out of the Ockenden report, was that we had some very important things to do as a consequence of the Ockenden report. But what we did end up with was a very long list of recommendations, which became almost impossible to operationalize, because a lot of them were deconstructing things to such a fine level without understanding how they fit together with the whole. So I think in many parts of the country, people are struggling with actually operationalizing the recommendations. And in the consequence, there are unintended consequences, because while those things are being dealt with, other things are not being dealt with. So, you know, there's an opportunity cost here, which we really need to acknowledge when we come to dealing with these kinds of safety reports. In contrast, to an extent, we had the East Kent review, which came up with 4 key principles for making change happen. So identifying poorly performing units properly and early, giving care with compassion and kindness, team working with a common purpose, and responding to challenge with honesty. And it seems to me that, that actually getting these things right creates this overall framework in which some of the other things that are listed in the Ogden recommendations will happen automatically. The spring will be eased, if you like, automatically if some of these phenomena or some of these concepts can be put into practice locally. And this picks up on this idea of making this happen locally, regionally, nationally, internationally to make a difference. I came into midwifery because I observed women having babies on a maternity mission station in Bophuthatswana. This was when apartheid was still operational, because I'm very, very old, in South Africa. And I remember looking at these women and this was, I was still an undergraduate at the time, looking at these women and thinking, if we get birth right, we get the world right. So it links up with this butterflies flapping their wing, and I still believe this. This is actually some learning from COVID-19. So this is one of the projects that we were funded for during COVID-19 to look at how the organisation of maternity and neonatal services played out during COVID-19 and what we can learn from that in terms of everyday services post-pandemic. I'm not sure we're ever going to be post-pandemic actually, but in this space we're in now. And these 10 phenomena, these 10 recommendations, if you like, came out of our data. So prevent staff burnout, integrate user and staff voices, ensure companionship, embed equity, enable autonomy, foster a team ethos, target targets, so that we don't have a whole load of targets that don't deliver good quality. So a small number of very precise and very accurate targets. Rationalize red tape, make data usable, and consider unintended consequences. So I want to finish off just with a few minutes looking at one possible way of thinking that we might take forward potentially to help that to happen. So this so-called safety 2 thinking. And the idea of safety 2 thinking is that we do both the things we're currently doing, which is that we focus on when things go wrong. So the red box there, illustrates the point that very few things go wrong, but they can have massive consequences for individuals and beyond. But the problem is that at the moment, we operationalize our safety agenda based on only solutions to things that go wrong. And the idea of safety 2 is we also capture what goes right in the everyday, messy, complex world, interrelational world of health and social care practice. Things almost always go right, amazingly, because actually very often what we're doing when we do that kind of practice is we're not doing work as imagined, that is what's written in the guidelines and protocols and rules. We're doing work as done. How we make that work in that context, where women make different choices. For example, women and birthing people may make different choices, where we are short of staff, where we're short of resources. That is what happens every day. And the risk with only operationalizing, if you like, the nuts and bolts of what goes wrong in an environment where things are generally going right, is we may tip over what's actually functioning effectively and make it function ineffectively. We may, in fact, cause problems rather than solving them. And this slide just to show how safety 2 fits into a complex system. And by that, I mean complex in the sense of not complicated. This is a systems theory idea. So it's not complicated. There are simple rules that underpin complex systems. And if you get the simple rules right, and it may be, for example, those 4 phenomena that Bill Kirkup came up with out in the East Kent review, actually you may make this system and all the bits and pieces and parts that underpin it work smoothly together without having to standardize that or without having to enforce that on a day-to-day basis. So this question then, can we come closer to optimization of care based on values and principles through framing what we do through safety 2, which, as I say, does not neglect risk. We have to deal with that. We have to deal with when things go wrong, but it doesn't supervalue it to the detriment of when things go right.